First of all, I want to take this as an opportunity to say this is a true honor for me to be able to speak to you this evening and let you know that, this is part of my journey of faith. This is my path that I understand the physical issues that Christ went through, and I struggle so hard with the man-God issue and how did he manage on both, and it's a struggle for me to try to understand that, the true mystery of that man and God mixture that we know him to be. So this evening, what we're going to concentrate on is the actual pain, suffering, the physical. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of the spiritual or the I guess the church side of what we're doing. I'm truly wanting you to help me go through the process. What did he endure as a man? What would we as a human experienced as he experienced on the cross? It will be a focus on him, the man. And we'll be discussing that in more detail, etc. I also apologize that it can be graphic. This was horrific. This was horrible. This was beyond the worst. This was the worst of all the things that a human could do to another human. And that's what we'll be discussing. I want you to understand what he felt, what he understood, what happened physically to him, and his endurance through that time. I was worried I didn't talk about to Rick in the bulletin or whatever about kids. I didn't think about not wanting to bring kids to the thing tonight. I'm not going to be that graphic, but there are some graphic things that we will be talking about. We're going to look at the psychological that he went through, some of the issues that he had to deal with, but mostly the physical aspects of his suffering at Calvary. These are several of the sources that I got this from, and I've already had a request to post, where did I get this, where can they go for more information, and I told them that I would try to put this on the church's website, the sites that I went to, the books, the relative information that I had found. But a lot of the information comes from ancient Christian and non-Christian authors, and we'll go through those. This is the list. It's amazing what was actually historically present to us, not just from the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, but also other Roman and non-Roman historians throughout the time at that point. There are many modern authors who are out there. The one who got me started years ago may be from Jim Bishop, that he wrote A Day in the Life of Christ. And an excellent book to get you started in understanding some of the basics associated with this. The other is the Shroud of Turin. And this is a remarkable document that we have been able to archaeologically get so much information from a piece of cloth with the imprints associated with that. So Jesus is a man. Which picture do you relate to? And there's several there. Is it the shroud that we understand as being his imprints? Is it more Byzantine? Is it the Asian influence? Is it the African American? Where do we relate? Is it the European model? All of us put our own impressions of what we expect him to look like. And that's how we relate by who he looks like to us as a human. But in our knowledge of where he is and what he was looking like, we know he was of Jewish descent. He was a Galilean. And that's the physique that we understand him to have from his heritage, his lineage. The sizes, they've argued back and forth. This is what I found and probably is the most average of sizes that we feel like he probably was from a height and a weight, but even there are some arguments associated with that. When you look at the shroud and the measurements associated with that, it puts him at 5'8" to 5'9", very similar to what we found, but the shroud stretched over time. And how do they relate to that? When you look at archaeologic digs for the time associated with that era in 0 AD, the sizes were tiny, 5'1", and those were looked at over and over again for an average size Judean man at that time, 5'1" and 110 pounds. Very different than that American or European appearance that you and I think of at 5'1". I'm 5'11", and here he is 5'1". Can you imagine looking down at Christ? His brachiocephalic skull, and I use the big words, but it means his shorter, wider head. Instead of the taller, narrower head that you may have envisioned and seen in your drawings and that from others, that's the typical physique that we would see as a facial characteristic. You knew that. He was dark-complected, that olive-skinned Mediterranean look, but very suntan. They were out constantly. They were in the sun, walking and moving and doing. Many of the writings that we looked at showed him to be of average appearance. He wasn't really good looking. He was not ugly. They found him to be of average. He did not stand out. There's nothing in the literature anywhere that said he was attractive, that people were drawn to him because of his physique. They were drawn to him because of his words and actions. The hair length, lots of discussions there, whether it was long or short and what the parameters associated with that were. It was longer hair at the time was more of a regal nature. He had a higher stance in the community. Short hair was not. And so there was a lot of consternation about that. On the Shroud of Turin, the hair is certainly much longer. He was dark-eyed, that large Jewish hooked nose, and certainly bearded at the time. That was, again, a period of beardedness was your stature. You were not clean-shaven at the time. Very physically fit. Needless to say, they walked everywhere they went. They didn't have any mode of transportation associated with that at that time. And at his outset, we knew that he grew up in a carpenter's home. I'm sure he had much physical labor that he did around the house as well as in his public life. This is some renditions of what that might have looked like when they've looked at archaeologic findings and reconstructed skulls and that from the era. Very much different than the photographs and images that we've created in the last 2,000 years. This is the recreated image from the Shroud of Turin. Again, you would see that the face is a little bit elongated compared to what we would expect from archaeologic findings. So the image is still, everyone wonders and is awe of what that might be. But those are some at least factual, physical characteristics we can dig up and find for him. You know, I look back and think, and I wanted to bring the issue up, but when did Christ know that he was God? Was he lying in the manger saying, "Oh yeah, I'm God, this is great, hey guys, I'm God"? You know, when did that actually occur? And I'm not sure that was a realization. Maybe he got an inkling when he was in the temple at 12, and I must be doing my Father's will. But even then, I'm not sure that a 12-year-old could actually comprehend and imagine, or he would have started his public life at 12 and done his work at that point if he truly understood what his job, what his actions, what his dealings as God were to be on this earth. I imagine him slowly over time thinking, is this real? My mom has told me that I'm God. You know, I've had probably some images of time as God has spoken to him as he was growing up. And then in the River Jordan, and John is baptizing him, all of a sudden this dove comes down and he hears the voice, "You are my beloved Son." Can you imagine him standing there and hearing that for the first time and realizing, oh my goodness, it's real. I am. What am I going to do now? Can you imagine him feeling that emotion and starting now his direction and his ministry and knowing what he knows and what's going to happen and understanding that as a human, how am I going to do all of that? How am I going to respond to my Father and manage this in a human nature? Those struggles he had every single day of being man and God. And it leads us now to the agony as he goes to the garden. And he knows that this is absolutely the beginning of the end. He manages and goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. He travels probably about a mile from where the Passover he had just celebrated with his disciples and apostles. And in a map, you can look when he's up here in the upper room, and he travels out the gate, and he goes up to the Mount of Olives, and suddenly then to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he begins his agony. Psychologically, he certainly knew from his prayer time with God and the interactions that he had with his Father that death was certainly imminent, that his work was nearing completion. He now has experienced, he's going to know of betrayal by his friends. Those he had worked for 3 solid years and called specifically by name, he now knows betrayal of his closest people. And he's actually even questioning his actual role in this salvation. That's the psychological he had to endure. And in doing that, we know that from writings that his sweat was of blood. And this is a known fact. This is hematidrosis. You can say it also hemohidrosis. It means blood in sweat. And the stress, the anxiety, the traumatic psychological impact that was having on his blood pressure, his adrenaline, all of those were playing a role on those sweat glands as he was enduring the anxieties in the agony in the garden. At that point, the sweat and the loss was minimal. He did not have a tremendous amount of volume loss associated with this. In this terminology, this actually has happened to others. This is not an unknown thing. And you can see here physically that the blood that's lost through the skin is very thin. It's very minor. It's not a large amount of blood loss that you can see, and it's diluted by the sweat that others have experienced as well. It typically is from very thin-skinned, very sensitive skin that is easily traumatized. It's very close to the surface that this occurs. It's the hair follicle and all the blood vessels associated with that in the sweat gland. Because of that close interaction, that's how the blood, with leakage from the adrenaline and the hypertension that he was experiencing, actually leaked into the gland at that point, and why you see the hemohidrosis. And there's his agony and other representations that have occurred over the time. From the agony and his psychological issues with the Gethsemane, he totally had to walk after he begins the trial. He's now put in another 2.5 miles of trial time, of 6 different trials he had to try and endure. And you can see in the map, and I won't draw on it here, but he had to traverse from all these other different locations you can see for the Anna and Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin and Pontius Pilate and Herod and back to Pontius. They drug him everywhere in that time frame. So another 2.5 miles after what he'd already walked to Garden of Gethsemane. He was experiencing certainly a lack of sleep. He had not slept since the night before, and now it's nearing midnight with all of this trauma that he was going through psychologically, and now the humiliation in front of all of his higher people, the Sanhedrin and all of the temple, as well as the Roman guards and Roman hierarchy. The beating that he was experiencing even before the scourging. And it leads us to where he is now, the scourging. The abandonment, I can't imagine, that he's there by himself. Everybody's gone. He's been denied by everyone that he knows. No one now claims to know him at this point. After going through the trials and being condemned, they now send him to be scourged. And the scourging is well documented and it's seen in movies and that you've experienced recently. But the flogging was by a flagrum, and I'll show that in just a second. But he was totally stripped. The humiliation associated with that, he had no clothing on as he was strapped to a pole and tied up. The Roman rule associated with that, it was 39 blows. administered by two different guards, and they were counting each way back and forth with each other. It was intended to take the convicted individual to a point of almost collapse, so that the crucifixion would be a faster, less time committed down, kind of a period of time. I apologize. But it was to bring him down, to totally take him to a lowest level of energy. When they look at what the flagrum actually contained, and it speaks to it here, but there are bone fragments that were actually embedded and tied to the leather straps. And to add weight to it, there were actually metal balls attached to the end of the leather straps as well. The intent behind it was to inflict as much bruising and trauma to the tissues as possible. And the bone fragments were sharp and would actually penetrate the skin through the subcutaneous tissues and all the way down to muscle layer. So it was destroying all the tissues. It was typically imposed upon the back. And so it was the back, the buttocks, and the legs that were inflicted. This is where the wounds were actually occurring. And you can see here the directions from each of the two soldiers, how those were inflicted and which direction that he experienced. This is the Shroud of Turin, and the diagram showing what the blood marks on that shroud looks like. This is the cloth of the back that he was laying on. You can see the wounds certainly on the back, the shoulders, but also down to the buttocks, and it was all the way down on his legs as well. At the end of the scourging, he was taunted, he was ridiculed. The robe was placed on him as a king, and the crown of thorns was placed on him as, again, taunting. Here the shroud shows where the wounds actually were from all the thorns all the way around. The crown of thorns actually comes from this plant. It's very common. The jujube plant is very common in the area of Judea and Jerusalem, and was easily found. It was known to be a toxin as well from the thorns themselves. And that's the plant and what it looks like, and the thorns are quite long. Instead of a crown, it's actually a helmet. It was wound up into a helmet that was actually pushed onto the skull and locked into position because of the thorns penetrating into the skin. As time went on, and the swelling and the inflammation and the allergic reactions associated with the thorns, the scalp would actually swell, and actually the thorns would embed even further into the scalp because of that. This is new to me and did not realize this, but as you look, there is actually a relic associated with the crown of thorns. Anyone know where it is? Any idea? It's in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, and they have expositions the first Friday of the month, I believe. But I did not know that until I did the research on this, and I think that's amazing. As we traveled to Italy last year, and all the relics and all the things that we were able to see, to know that that's even available, and it's been tracked back. There are actually pieces of thorns that are relics in other churches around the world as well, but this is the most complete over time. So from the movie of Mel Gibson, this is the view of that, but this is a representation of where he was and what he was doing after the end of the scourging. And again, the intent was to take him to near death. That was what their goal was with the scourging. And emotionally, he was alone. He was denied by his disciples. He was defeated and helpless. Physically, he was already weak. He was tired. He was hungry. At this point, was now becoming dehydrated with the loss of the fluids from the scourging. As we discussed, he was traumatized, extremely bruised, tons of swelling from the leakage and what we call third spacing of his fluids from inside his blood vessels out into the skin tissues. The skin on his back, buttocks, and thighs, just destroyed. I mentioned the blood loss at that point. But that's the current state before he's even crucified. This is where he is at this point. He still had to muster up the energy to continue the process, knowing what he needed to do, knowing what was intended, what was written in the Scriptures. He knew, well-versed, what was still to come. The cross that he was to carry is actually what we call the low tile cross. And it's sort of represented that in the metal there below. It really did not have a top part of the T associated with that as we envision a cross in these days. The stipes is the term called for the vertical piece, and the patibulum was the cross piece at the top. The titulus was the actual inscription that was used to attach to the top of the cross. I've got another representation of that. This was the actual relic of the titulus, and this is actually a half of the inscription. And this, anybody knows where this one is? I was getting intrigued. It's in the Basilica of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem. And I didn't find the other piece. I didn't look far enough and fast enough to find the other. But this is half of that inscription associated with it. To imagine that these are still around. I mean, that somebody actually thought, well, we may need to save that. How did they know this and do all of that? It's just amazing at that day and age. So this is a drawing representation, and you can see, again, the stipes that's permanently situated at the crucifixion sites. The actual cross that Christ would have carried at that time was actually the patibulum. The footrest here, called the sedillo, is a later representation of crosses that they were able to find, but that is not present at the day and time that he was crucified. There was no footrest when he was crucified. And again, with the titulus here, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew were the languages that represented that this is the King of the Jews. For the carrying of the cross, the patibulum was tied to the victim. So his arms are outstretched. He's physically tied to a bar that's quite heavy. It was anywhere from 75 to 125 pounds that he's carrying across his shoulders. Unfortunately, when you have your arms outstretched and something across your back and you fall, you cannot catch yourself. And many people theorize that the trauma to his face and chest were very, very significant, not just to the superficial tissues, but actually heart trauma. That some people have theorized that he actually may have had a rupture of the heart due to the chest trauma associated with his falls. So think about that as you're standing here and you cannot physically catch yourself as you're falling. Very difficult for me to imagine that. And he fell 3 times. As you remember, Simon was asked to carry the cross for him, and he was able to successfully then make it all the way, the 500 to 650 yards to Golgotha. This is the map again that he was at, and he was going here and had to be taken out to the skull place. At the time, Golgotha appeared to be an abandoned quarry that had multiple areas dug out of rock. And as you looked at it, it actually looked like a skull from where they had dug the rock out. And that's why it was called the skull place. When he arrives, he is again stripped. The only thing that remains for him at that point is a loincloth. The problem with that robe, not that he was wearing, is that all dried blood from his back was now ripped again from his back and reopened all of those wounds that he had just endured. At this point, he was laid down. The bar was The patibulum was untied from him and is stretched out across the bar. The actual nails, the spikes that they use are about that size. They were pretty long in length. And they've actually found true archaeologic findings of these in burial sites of the size and diameter and descriptions here, as you can see drawn. The typical representation of nailing of the hand did not actually occur into the palm. If you can imagine putting a nail through your palm and putting any weight against that, all of this would have ripped right out of your hand. And when they look at writings associated with the time, the wrist actually was described as part of the hand in their medical writings in Jewish times. And so he was nailed in the quote-unquote hand, but actually was nailed into the wrist. If you feel right at the end of your wrist, the end of the forearm, there are two bones. One is the ulna, one's the radius. And there's a soft area between the two. There's a few tendons and that run between it. That's where they drove the nail. There are several very thick bands of tissue that run across the wrist here, one of which causes your carpal tunnel syndromes that closes off and causes the weakness in that of your hand. But there are several bands of tissue, extensor area, that go across here. And it was that keeps the nail from ripping out across the wrist and across the hand. Those bands are very, very strong. There are nerves and arteries to either side that follow the bones. Unfortunately, there is also a median nerve that runs right through that space. The nail, at that point, would actually pierce the median nerve, sending pain and trauma out through the hand distal to that area. And you can see the markings, that nerve right there. In the representations, this is again the Shroud of Turin, and you can see here, again, the markings of the thorns, but you also see the marking of where that nail went through the wrist instead of the hand. So again, we have pretty good evidence of where that was. There were 4 guards that escorted him out. And it is those 4 guards that actually then, after he's nailed, lift the bar up on top of the stipes, the vertical piece of the cross. And it was attached by a mortise and tenon joint and held in place because of that joint. Once he was raised and literally hanging by his wrists, they now take his legs and they start to fold his legs upward, so the bottom of his feet can actually rest against the vertical bar of the stipes. So he was able to bring his feet up, and they, at that point, nailed his 2 feet flat against the stipes. There was no footrest. Again, that was not at this day and age. And this is his position. This is how he was hanging. At that point, the titulus, the sign that was marched out with him during the carrying of the cross, was attached to the top of the cross as well. In my research, it was interesting. I never knew this before, but he was offered the wine with myrrh, and that was a Jewish tradition to sedate the individual going for crucifixion, and he refused. And lots of theories associated with that, but he wanted to, at this point, we would envision as God, he would want to endure without any sedation. He did not want to be put down psychologically or neurologically. He knew what he had to do. With the feet, it went through the tarsal bones right in the middle of each. And again, there's nerves that have to be right there. And that's the medial nerve. And that, again, the nail went directly through the medial nerve. Because the weight was pushing on it, all of the weight here of the leg was pushing down on all of his tarsal bones at this point. There are 4 different types of shock that the body can experience. At this point, we know that he was already experiencing hypovolemic shock, and that term means low volume. He did not have enough blood volume. He was dehydrated, and he had loss of blood. So his heart had very little fluid to be able to pump throughout his body. And because of that, he certainly was experiencing hypovolemic shock. We theorize he also had what we call cardiogenic shock from the falls that he had experienced and not be able to catch himself. And now he had direct trauma to the chest wall and likely the heart as well. So he now is experiencing cardiogenic shock. The pump itself is damaged. So if he had all the blood volume and everything else right for him, the heart itself was actually damaged. We also know that he had neurogenic shock, multiple nerves, not just from the hands and the feet, but all of the nerves on his back, buttocks, and legs had all been injured. And if you can imagine the pain associated with that, that's what we call neurogenic shock. It shuts the body down. The body, in a method of trying to protect itself, shuts the body down to protect itself from the pain inflicted. Many people with severe pain pass out, and that's what we mean by neurogenic shock. The fourth shock that he did not apparently have was what we call septic shock. He was not infected at that point. He certainly would have experienced sepsis later, but for him, that was the only shock that he was not experiencing. It is extremely rare to experience any more than two, much less he is experiencing 3 types of shock. This is where it gets a little detailed, and I just will do it quickly. My wife told me don't go into too much medical detail, but I want to show that the human body's capability of responding to these stressors, that as blood volume, as everything is happening, the body responds by increasing the heart rate. It tries to increase the blood pressure by tightening down blood vessels. It does everything it can. It releases adrenaline. I mean, all these protective mechanisms are occurring to try and sustain the life that Christ had at that point. The only problem is that can only be sustained for a certain period of time. At some point, there's nothing else there, and that's when you fall off the curve and death ensues. But he had 3 different episodes of shock that were occurring to him at the same time, and that's what he was going to experience. So with the crucifixion, many people theorize that this was actually a slow suffocation that he was also going to now go through. So as he's hanging there, if you can imagine, arms fully outstretched, all of the weight of the body is on his arms and his wrists, and minimal amount is on his feet. When you expand that, he's going from respiratory insufficiency, he will then quickly go to what we call respiratory failure, and lastly, respiratory arrest, meaning he's not getting enough oxygen in and out of the lungs to satisfy the metabolic needs of his body to continue. So now we have all the pump issues and all the shock issues, and now we're throwing a respiratory issue on top of him as well. This is the mechanism of breathing that was having to occur while hanging from the cross. If you take your arms and hang them up above your head, that expands your chest cavity. And in doing so, that's generally your full inspiration. So here he is hanging with his arms up. His chest cavity is full of air at that point. His issue was not getting air in. He couldn't get air out. And to get air out, he had to raise himself by his arms and feet to allow that expansion of the chest to actually go down and allow his diaphragm to start to allow air to come out. Every breath. And that's what this represents. He's pulling himself up and down for every single breath to sustain his life. And he did that for 3 hours. At this point, all the other things we're talking about, let's throw on top of it the muscular weakness that he's now experiencing. He's building up what we call lactic acid. Lactic acid is that when your muscles are sore, you've worked out and you're tired and they feel sore, that's lactic acid in your muscles. He cannot get the lactic acid out of his muscles to get rid of the soreness and tenderness, and it continues to build up. He's strained all of his muscles. He's done and been through everything already, walking and traversing and carrying a cross, trying to breathe. There's nothing left for him. Again, we talked about this, when he was stripped of his garments, the wounds were all opened. They speak of the birds that would fly up and land and peck at his wounds. And this was a common phenomenon. This was not something that was unusual. You can imagine you have animals eating at your skin. The amount of nerve damage that he was experiencing, all over. The bruising, the swelling. And now we talk about dislocations. The one thing that was helping him survive was his arms being able to pull himself up and down, up and down, up and down. But because of the muscular weakness and the ability to have to continue to pull the entire weight of the body up with your arms, the likelihood is he dislocated his elbows and his shoulders. And once you've done that, he has no mechanisms other than his legs to come up to let this air out of his lungs. And he's hanging there with no one, just his mother and 2 other women and John. Everyone's gone. Can you think of the conversation that his mother must have tried to have? How do you speak? Oh, I'm going to cry now. It's unimaginable what he had to endure. So the theory behind his death is certainly at the end, on top of everything else, is a slow suffocation. The shallow breathing, respiratory collapse, the decreased oxygenation, fluid actually builds up into his lungs. The heart, again, stressed more than it already was stressed, and eventually fails. I found this term, in the Latin term of excruciating. Anytime you use that word, out of the cross, this is the utmost of terms, amount of pain, suffering, and separation that anyone can occur is excruciating. And it's at this point, when he gives up his body, that he has given up his true body for us. Crucifixion was brutal. It was the worst. Nailing was the worst of crucifixions. Many were tied, not nailed. So you were fortunate if you got tied. Nailing was the actual worst. But many people it's difficult to get them to actually finally die, and so the Roman soldiers were actually at points time to say, go out and break their legs. Let's make this thing happen. Typically 1 to 3 days. If you were tied to the cross, you could last 1 to 3 days hanging on the cross. And again, I come back to the point of the scourging. The scourging was to try to take them as quickly to the end so the crucifixion was slower. The breaking of the legs allowed that suffocation to happen quicker. When they came and saw Christ, they found he was dead. He had died much faster than they had anticipated. And instead of breaking his legs, as Scripture said that would not happen, they pierced his chest, and from that water and blood poured from him. When you look at the diagrams associated with that, the sword actually pierced his right chest, and at that point went through what we feel like is a pleural sac full of fluid because of what we've talked about with respiratory failure. So the water buildup in the pleural sac, the lung sac, as it went through the pleura, then it entered the pericardium here, and there was fluid building up around his heart from trauma, and as well as the heart failure that he was experiencing. And then it pierced into what we consider the right ventricle. And the right ventricle would have been engorged, would have been larger at that point because it was unable to get blood through the lungs. And the right ventricle, the wall is very thin, very floppy. It does not require a lot of blood pressure to pump the blood through the lungs. And so it engorged itself as well. So as he was pierced, you now can see where the blood and water would have come from that wound. And as we look at the Shroud of Turin, the wound marks here are actual, and that's what we're seeing. And you can see that this is actually the back side, and you can see the front side here. When I first looked at it, I thought, wait a minute, that's the left. Why isn't it the right? Because everybody's saying it's the right side that was pierced. And in actuality, when you take the shroud and lay it over the individual, what you're seeing are the actual individual, but the marks that were left on the shroud are a reverse image of that. And so it makes more sense, and it shows that his right chest was pierced. So here we have the piercing, and when we see that he actually gave his body and his blood for the remission of our sins. My dad and I talked before this a few days ago, and he said, do you know about the theories and thoughts behind what each of those wounds and what they represented to us as what our sins are? And his thoughts were these, that the crown of thorns certainly deal with all the sins of our thoughts. Hands and feet, the actions or omissions that we experience as humans. All the sins of our heart. The scourging, the sins of our flesh. And the carrying of the cross, the weight of all the sins that he had to endure. Thank you.